So Herman and Chomsky posit a link between ideology and propaganda in the very first paragraph of this week's reading. The mass media, they argue, serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. It's their function to amuse, entertain, and inform, and here's the big one, to inculcate individuals with values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of a larger society. In a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of interest, to fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda. So in this passage, you see Herman and Chomsky identify mass media as an ideological apparatus. And to carry out that kind of ideological work where you get people to believe and to live by the codes and norms and values that you want them to live by, you need propaganda. Now, doing this kind of work is more straightforward in authoritarian countries where the state enjoys monopolistic control over the media. Right? In that case, the ruling elite own the media and they can spew whatever propaganda they want. There's no one putting pressure on them. But it's harder to see how the elite could run an effective propaganda machine in countries like the US and the United Kingdom, where, quote, the media actively compete, periodically attack and expose corporate and government malfeasance, and aggressively portray themselves as spokesmen for free speech and the general community interest. So Herman and Chomsky, they come in with their analysis here. They say what no one ever acknowledges is that the media's critiques of corporations and governments are in fact extremely limited. So why is that? If journalists speak truth to power and they serve as these kind of watchdogs in the fight against corporate and government malfeasance, why are their critiques so limited? And the answer from Herman and Chomsky is that because the people with money and power are able to filter out the news that they think is fit to print. They can marginalize dissent and they can allow the government and dominant private interests to get their messages across to the public. So to explain how this works, Herman and Chomsky offer what they call the propaganda model, which is basically constituted by a set of news filters. So the idea of a filter is that there's this raw material of news, there's what's actually happening out there in the world, and that raw material has to pass through a successive layer of filters, leaving only the cleansed residue that the most powerful and rich think is fit to print. So the idea is that these filters are used by the elite class, the powerful, the wealthy, to define what's newsworthy, and also to define the terms of reasonable debate about what's newsworthy. So the filters work so well that media news people, often operating with complete integrity and goodwill, convince themselves of their own objectivity. And the idea is that these news people are in fact very objective and they have great integrity and they're very committed, but they're only objective within the limits of the filter constraint. And these constraints are so powerful and they're built into the system in such a fundamental way that alternative bases of news choices are hardly even imaginable. So a classic example where Chomsky kind of illustrates this point on the fly is this conversation he had with Andrew Marr in an interview on the BBC, where Marr is trying to challenge the propaganda model at a certain point. And Marr says, look, we journalists, we see ourselves as a kind of crusading class. We speak truth to power, but you seem to be suggesting that we're self-censoring or that we're spewing propaganda somehow in an intentional way. And Chomsky says, no. I'm not saying that you're self-censoring. I'm sure you believe absolutely everything you say. I'm saying that, quote, if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting. So it's a very powerful moment, and it's suggesting that you could go through life thinking of yourself as this kind of watchdog, somebody who's sort of keeping track of the powers that be and making sure they stay in their place and all this sort of thing. But because the powers that be have so thoroughly shaped your perspective within a certain set of limits about what's newsworthy and what reasonable discourse about what's newsworthy looks like, your objectivity is very narrowly constrained.